tonight. Are there any more speakers for this item? All right, welcome. What an
Hi.
honor.
Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for having us. I wasn't going to speak. I was just coming to give moral support to the program. But as I'm Paul Wong, and as a senior artist of this community, and as someone who has been actively developing independent culture alternative with the underground scene for over 40 years, who has participated in organizing and sanctioning a great deal of unspoken illegal events over my 40-year period, I welcome this program that allows these young people and other people of all ages to work with the city to create alternative cultural venues, be they art exhibitions, dance performances, underaged party events, uh, raves, mixed media exhibitions, things that go on through the night, to the afternoon for 24 hours, cinemas and parking lots. It's a good thing because that's where I learned my craft, from being able to be experimental, doing things in funky spaces that were affordable and accessible. I've gone to a lot of these places. I've stayed from the beginning to the end. I've seen how these people are taking it seriously, adapting, trying to be legal, trying to be conscientious, and trying specifically to create an incredible arena of creativity that has introduced other artists to other artists and have given people the opportunity to express themselves in new and different ways, often for the first time. And it leads to other incredible things because we need spaces of experimentation. We need raw, unproven places where new types of communities can come together. And that is not the downtown club scene. That is not the Vancouver Art Gallery. That is not the artist-run scenes in the universities. These are our young people who come from all of those places, and they need places to germinate and to come together and form community. So I support loosening up and even being more experimental with this program to see where it can go, because it will lead to great things. Thank you.
Hey, you have questions, Mr. Wong. You've provoked some questions. Councillor Ball?
Mr. Wong, thank you so much for being here. I'm particularly interested how having communities like this and spaces like this allows for success. And we have many artists here who have gone on to worldwide success because they were able to start somewhere and have a community. And can you talk about that growth process? In every other industry, it's called research and development, but we don't have that in the arts. And I'm fascinated with the process here.
But I can talk certainly from my personal experience, my own development, and also as a facilitator that has helped and assisted other artists in their development. I went to high school here, and I didn't go to post-secondary school. My post-secondary learning was really hanging out with other artists in warehouse spaces, in storefront spaces, working collectively. I'm one of the founders of the Video Inn. And through a mentor, a bunch of us got together and got a storefront at 261 Powell Street. That developed 20 years later to working with a business person who got us 1965 Main Street, which is where Vancouver Art and Leisure are. They took over that space because it got gentrified, and now that organization has moved somewhere else. But as a curator and programmer, you put people together, and you create situations where they can have creative flow. And through that creative flow, certainly for myself, it's introduced me to other ways of expressing myself and sharing that expression with others. We learn to do these things together. When I picked up a video camera, no one else was doing that. We learned it by doing it. I didn't know anything about lighting or sound or dance, but I worked with people who knew a little bit more than I did. And together, we have grown, formed our own companies, employ people, exhibit here and around the world, and use whole dimension of people and skills to create our products.
Thank you very much. And as a theater artist who performed in almost every small stage and tiny place there was to perform in the early days, I know what a difference it makes to being able to move forward, as you're saying, and to create the community around you. So we really appreciate your work, and I'm thrilled with this report and delighted to be able to move it forward. So I'm just, thank you for coming in today. I know what you have done in the city and how much you've contributed. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so.
Okay, well said. Oops, I just nuked
Good,
everyone
thank
off
you.
the list here. You have more questions. Councillor Deal is
Over
next.
here, Paul. Thanks, Mr. Wong, and I think you've actually already answered my question. I'll ask it. If you have anything to add, feel free. As someone who has worked in the entire ecosystem of the arts here in Vancouver and in leadership roles, I was just going to ask how you think this fits into that ecosystem, but I think you've pretty much answered that. But if you had anything to add in the specific role that this type of program helps to support, that would be great.
You know, we need alternatives all the time, whatever that might be. You know, pilot programs in all areas is a good way of looking at it. And certainly in a city that is growing exponentially, you know, economically and size-wise, and you know, we're a young emerging culture that has a lot to offer. So you know, we have to be flexible. I think we have to take risk, and if we fall down, we'll help ourselves get back up, and we'll try it again a little bit differently. So I mean, that's how I've learned. I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I'm happy to share my successes and the mistakes so that others can learn from it.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Councillor Stevenson, one more question.
I don't actually have some philosophical question about the arts. I'm just curious as to why you've got a target in the middle of your chest.
Actually, this is a city of this is a Paul Wong Projects brand called Five, and it was actually a City of Vancouver Olympic Commission from 2010.
Oh, wow.
All right.
That was a philosophical question I asked. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's all your questions. Paul, thank you for being here. I should say Mr. Wong. And did we have one more hand that was raised, or any more speakers for this item? Last call. Any more speakers for this item? Okay, we will close our speakers list, and on this one, we will go to questions of staff. I don't know if these are all questions, but Councillor Ball was first up for questions. Was that you?
Yeah, I
thought
think
you were left
Councillor
over on there.
Stevenson was before me.
Councillor Stevenson, why don't you go first?
Thanks. Well, these questions arise from the questions that were asked regarding some of the potential problems. So maybe I'd like to start with the police and ask the police as to, if you wouldn't mind. So what's your recommendation on this program, and do you have any concerns about the amount of alcohol consumed, or what do you think about this suggestion that we try and limit it to 2 or 3 or 4 drinks?
Well, I'm Alex Clark. I'm the liquor coordinator for Vancouver Police, and I've been working with Cultural Services and the city on this pilot project for probably more than 4 years, 3-4 years. So we've monitored a lot of the places and worked with a lot of the operators. The positive side of it is that it's very exciting to see spaces used for events that are, I'd say, very positive for the arts community. It is an alternative space, alternative to nightclubs, because not everybody does want to go to a nightclub. Any of the events that we have had issues with, there was just one particular place. It no longer operates under the pilot program anymore because they did experience a lot of noise complaints. And I think it wasn't necessarily them in particular, is just the area in which they were situated was a little problematic in terms of noise and activity for a very quiet residential neighborhood.
But you
Anytime.
don't see a necessity to, you don't see a necessity to limit as a suggestion of 2 or 3 drinks?
I think that's a good idea. I just wonder how we would do it. They do apply for a provincial special occasion license online, and the process now is an online process, and they do apply for a license through the liquor coordinator through the licensing department of the city. So we work together and we look at each event and we look and see what kind of event it is. If we have questions, we'll often phone one of the operators and go, hey, what is this event? We have a really good working relationship with all the spaces and their operators. It would be difficult to limit the amount of alcohol. I mean, it's worth exploring and worth looking at, but as for the police, we're not going to these events to deal with people who are overly intoxicated, people who are being taken away by ambulance because they're unable to take care of themselves because they're, too intoxicated. We're not going for assaults, anybody who's fighting. Because they operate under the private special occasion license, they pre-sell their tickets. So a lot of times they already know who's coming to these events through their social media advertisement, through Facebook. They know a lot of the people, and there's a responsibility that goes along with attending events, and I think people they kind of hold each other accountable.
So you sound pretty positive.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just would like to ask another question and to staff, and that's regarding the insurance issues that were raised. If you could fill us in on whether all of these will have insurance if there's, as was suggested, maybe an accident or something.
So good evening, Andrea Toma, Chief License Inspector. I just want to clarify on the licensing. We do not license any of these events. The licensing is purely through the special occasion liquor licensing, and nor do we have jurisdiction to set limits on liquor. That is something that's within the jurisdiction of the province, and they're the ones that have the liquor inspectors and that measure that. On the insurance, we don't have our legal representative here, but I did manage to check with them. There is no liability if for the city to hold such a program if it happens that the event coordinator does not have adequate insurance. There's no liability to the city directly.
So there could be liability to the
Correct.
organization.
To the organization, it could be liability to the property owners, but not to the city for promoting the program.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. That's
Okay.
all my questions.
Councillor Ball, questions?
Yes, I'm not sure who in staff would answer this one, but we've heard a number of requests why we're just adding one extra time very conservatively, and I'm just wondering, is there a reason why it's not one a week or 4 times a month, or what's the purpose of such a stepped up?
There are a number of reasons, and I would defer to both the fire department and the police department, as well as the planning department, about the specific reasons. But most of them are life safety issues. Sometimes there are zoning issues. But in general, what's happening is we're allowing events, live performance events, to take place in non-assembly spaces. So the requirements are much lower. But it still is, once you go into an assembly space, the requirements are much, much higher. And so it's balancing the risk with the reward in essence. We're taking a slight risk by doing this, and it's a risk that, and I shouldn't speak on behalf of fire and police, that they feel comfortable with, but once you exceed a certain number, you're getting into a regular use issue.
Good evening. My name is Rick Chung, Assistant Chief. So getting to the use of the building, the building codes, building bylaw does look at the building and its intended use. So if the intended use was for non-assembly, then the requirements are much lower, like Richard had said. So 3 times per month will limit we can perceive that the building has a limited use for assembly. So it's not a regular use. Once you get into a regular routine to be a once a week, then it becomes regular, and we would be looking at that as an intended use for the building, which would need to have upgrades to meet the assembly requirements.
So, for instance, say a bookstore, and you want to do book readings, which is a kind of event where somebody's reading from their book, and it's a very limited audience. Are those kinds of limitations, do they also apply in this case of the event? Is that considered the same kind of risk, I think, is what you're talking about?
For that particular example, I would say that book reading is part of the operations of that bookstore. It's a limited number of people. We're not opening up to a wider audience. It's just the people that go to the bookstore, and they have an event like that. But that won't be considered a general assembly type event.
And so a record store having a small event to celebrate or launch a record, or again, a relatively controlled environment. Is that the same kind of thing that we're looking at here?
Right, so we're looking at number of capacity. So beyond a certain number of people, then will be considered assembly. But if it's a small number of people, a small event, it'll be considered ancillary or subsidiary to the main purpose of that venue.
And how, and again, I'm sorry, I've read the report, but I just don't remember the number of people that what's the sort of the highest number before it becomes an assembly?
As I recall, I believe that the number is 30 people.
Okay.
So above 30 will be part of this program. Under 30 would not require.
Okay. And do you see any point in time when, say, another year goes by or 2 years and this is successful, of being able to expand in a safe way?
At this time, I don't see an increase. Between 3 times per month is pretty well the max. Otherwise, 4 times per month, you are pretty well getting into once a week, which becomes a regular event.
Even though it's held at different times, it's still regular because it's occurring once a week. Okay.
Yeah.
So just so I understand. Well, thank you for your help here. I appreciate it. It's good to have the limit and know what's possible within those rules. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Carr, questions?
Yes, actually, I have a same line of questioning, so thank you very much for staying there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is the difference between 3 times a month and weekly, is that an interpretation by our fire service or police force, or is that actually written into the zoning bylaw?
Well, it's part of the building bylaw as well as the fire bylaw that a building is designed for its intended use. And so there is an interpretation, yes, there is.
There is an interpretation, okay.
So we would say, yes, once a week now becomes more of a regular use of the building than the occasional use.
Right. So if council wanted to increase the number, maybe not tonight, but maybe in the future, as I think Councillor Ball was intimating, we would have to look at clarifying the interpretation of building purpose and use in terms of assembly. Would that be correct?
Yes, we have within the bylaws, fire and building bylaw, there is a requirement for interpretation of that term.
Okay, that's great. It's good for us to know. Did you have something else to add? Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I'm Pat Ryan, the Chief Building Official.
Right.
Rick actually used to work for me. He gave a really good answer. But yeah,
That was
if you
clear.
were looking at expanding it, it would in essence be a rewriting of the building bylaw and would be a fairly fundamental shift in the principle behind it. Because we very much, in Vancouver, we've set a very high standard for life safety for many years around seismic, fire safety. Then we've got very high standards on energy, all that sort of thing. This is a balance between trying to avoid underground use and allowing it in the mainstream. And we're trying to meet that happy median between the two. We felt that going to, in essence, a once-a-week operation is creating a regular use, which is starting to really fall under what we call assembly uses.
Yeah.
And it all sounds well and good, but if something goes wrong and we have a regular use, then we have a bit of a problem to deal with.
Right.
So we were comfortable with the 3, but going beyond that, we don't have much comfort going any further. And the other thing you need to think of is many of these operators are great, but you will get some who will push the limits. So a lot of our bylaws are designed around potential problems
Right.
and not necessarily your best applicants who do a really good
Right.
job, because it's applied
Right.
to everybody.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That made it very clear for me. I have a couple of other questions. Others have been answered, but I do have a couple of other questions. Regarding bathroom lighting, are we not requiring any of these premises to have lighting in the bathrooms?
They normally have lighting, so if they're not providing lighting, that's the problem. The only change we did is we didn't provide emergency lighting in a small bathroom.
Yeah.
Basically on the premise that you'll see enough light coming
Right.
through the cracks above the door that you'll be
So
able
if
to
all
see.
the lights went out, if the power
There's still
went out,
emergency lighting, so it's not a
Right.
big problem. So we did
Okay.
a minor relaxation around that. So if there's no lighting, that's more an operational issue of the people running it.
okay, and they just somebody should complain and ask them to put light bulbs in.
Or it's at basic sanitation, keeping things
Right.
clean, keeping it safe.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. My final question that hasn't been asked yet has to do with the land use and the fact that some of the speakers made it quite clear that they thought that there were conflicts if there was residential uses mixed in with industrial uses. So I wonder if I could have some clarification around the fact that these venues are in areas that they are being the applications which are being received and approved are basically in areas where we anticipate not a conflict with nearby residential uses.
Hello, my name's Diana Liang. I'm one of the cultural planners working on this. Actually, the only zones that are allowed under this program are commercial, and most of the commercial and industrial areas, so residential areas aren't allowed. But there are, obviously, with our complex zoning in the city, there are industrial areas are adjacent to residential areas and all that. So the licensing staff do look at that, and in one location that was in an industrial area but very close to residential, we found that it wasn't working, and the license staff had to give warnings, and eventually that venue did close down.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're well aware of the situation, and we're mitigating on any potential problems by examining the adjacency. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay, Councillor DiGenova, questions for staff?
I have a few questions, and I'll let staff determine who should answer them. My first question is regarding page 4 of the report. It talks about over 100 diverse events that took place. I'm wondering how many of these events are all ages? Are these events all ages?
I'll defer to Diana, who knows much more about the actual events that have.
Not all events are all ages. In fact, actually, I don't know which ones are restricted, but we do know that most of the events under this program did have liquor licenses to serve liquor. But there have been a few in the tail end of the 2-year pilot where there were dry events.
Okay. That's very helpful. And then I'm not sure, maybe this will be a question for you as well. On page 4, it talks about over 100 diverse events. We've heard from some speakers that out of those 100 events he attended to, and his experience at some of those events was not a pleasant one. And then on Appendix D, page 1 of 1, I'm looking down at the bottom. It says certain organizers of larger events, 120-person site capacity and larger, provided additional feedback relating to the level of enforcement and stigma of their art form. These organizers felt that the misunderstanding of their art form has led to police watching them too closely and has generated unfair complaints from their neighbors. So I'm just wondering, do you have any there's the perception and then there's the sort of the factual information. Do you have any record of how many of these events police have had to attend to?
Yeah, so actually the monitoring was split between BPD, proper use inspection, and fire inspection.
and occasionally with our colleagues in the Provincial Liquor Board. And we monitored 1 in 6 events with a much higher focus on larger events or events that pose a higher risk. The ones that we looked at, some of them also had complaints, perhaps from neighbors or competition, and staff has a responsibility to look into those.
Okay, so is there any sort of number as to how many events out of the 100 had complaints? Was it a small number? Even
It was about 15%, but most of the complaints were directed at primarily 2 locations.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much.
And we're on to Councillor Deal. Questions?
Actually, I'm prepared to move the recommendations and make a few comments. All the questions were well answered and well asked and well answered, so I don't need to go back to those. It's funny, I was going back through some of the history on this, and I won't say when I brought the motion forward to look into this, but it was more than 2 years ago. Anyway, I'm not going to give the date, but you can look it up if you want to, but I noticed that in this article it says that I think we'll see results within 6 months. So here we are, a few years later, and something that seemed like it would be fairly straightforward turned out to be very complex. And I cannot thank our staff enough, and I cannot thank the community enough for helping us recognize the flaws, helping us recognize the strengths and the weaknesses and the things that needed to change. I have been tireless in trying to get us as many nights a month as possible, and this is the compromise that means you don't need sprinkler systems and that extra washroom and the extra exit and all those things that make spaces not accessible anymore, especially in those affordable types of buildings. So this is the magic number that allows us to both meet that basic safety requirement that we were not going to compromise, and yet allow these spaces in the most funky, diverse, interesting places in the city. I hate seeing a space that's only used for one purpose and only for a few hours a day, and this is allowing some of those spaces to really take on a second life, whether it's retail or industrial. It's allowing them to have multiple purposes. When the city is expensive and dense as ours, we really need those multi-use spaces. We've seen theater in these spaces, photography exhibits, dances, all kinds of things. I just think it's a fabulous thing. But again, it's been a long, hard slog, harder than we thought it would be. And I just have to take my hat off again to staff. Diana, you have just been a champion, and everybody else. But I know you know every inch and every license and every person and every exit door, and you probably know which light bulb needs replacing. So, and again, I wanted to thank all of our staff and the police and fire. You know, we rely so heavily on you making sure, and Pat, your team, on making sure that we met that basic safety requirement, because that was the line we were not going to drop below. And I think we really found that balance. And we'll always continue to look at the program to see if there are improvements that can be made. But again, thanks for being at the table, all of you who run those events. Thanks for keeping the pressure on and making sure that we got it tuned up as well as we could. And I think this is a great result, and I'm very, very happy to see it approved tonight.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Deal.